If you're a diehard fan of any musical genre that primarily exists in an underground scene, I'm sure you've had the experience of discovering a band or artist who you just can't believe doesn't have a bigger following. As much as it can hurt to see a band that made such phenomenal music get buried by countless other bands to come out of the same scene though, if you happen to be the person that stumbles upon them first, then you get to be the one who enlightens other people about them. But more importantly, it also means that the very organic energy they were able to capture does not disappear at any point in their catalog. And even if they have a release that you personally don't like as much as the others, the energy is still there, and you can easily hear that there was never a point in their career that their music became particularly generic or boring. How's it going, folks? My name is Jack Miller. I am the incredibly underqualified punk historian, and today I am very excited to talk to all of you about a band that I have a very strong attachment to, Rich Kids on LSD. For those of you who don't know, Rich Kids on LSD, otherwise known as RKL, was a metal-influenced California punk band that begun in the early 80s and has had a very large impact on the subgenres of skate punk, hardcore, and crossover thrash. Unlike some of their contemporaries like Suicidal Tendencies or Bad Religion though, RKL remains a very obscure band despite the huge impact they had on a lot of the scene's key players. Before we dive in, I thought I'd mention I made a Spotify playlist of some of my favorite RKL songs, and you can find that in the description below. And lastly, if you are interested in weekly videos about punk rock, may I humbly ask that you please subscribe to my channel here. I'm having a lot of fun making these, and I want to make sure that all of you can keep having fun watching them. Anyways, the story of RKL begins in the town of Montecito, California. Early in their teens, founding members Chris Rest and Bomber Manzullo were playing music together, and they decided to turn their jam sessions into a full band. They recruited their friend Joey Cape to play rhythm guitar, who brought along his friend Jason Sears as a lead vocalist. Joey insisted that Jason had to sing for the band if they wanted him to play guitar. Unfortunately for Joey though, he was shortly dropped by the band due to his poor rehearsal attendance from being grounded all the time. The band would then go through a series of different musicians before bassist Vince Peppers and guitarist Alan Alpo Duncan stepped in. Once the band was officially established, the majority of the songwriting duties went to the multi-instrumentalist drummer Bomber, and with all of these wicked drum tracks on so many of their songs, it does not surprise me at all that he played such a key role in the writing process. The frequent member changes like I just described here is something that happened to RKL a lot throughout their career, and it's probably one of the reasons they never got as big as they could have been. Anyways, the band now had what you could call its first official lineup, and they started playing shows in the Southern California scene. In fact, RKL were so eager to start playing shows that they rolled up to their first gig ever without a band name. According to an interview with Thrasher magazine in 2002, Jason Sears said the band actually got its name at that show after a random attendee said something along the lines of, "Those kids will never be anything. They're just a bunch of rich kids on LSD." Having nothing better to call their band, they decided to just put Rich Kids on LSD on their flyers, and it stuck with them the rest of their career. Around this time is also when the band's iconic Beanie Boy mascot was born. As the story goes, while Jason and Bomber were being tattooed, Bomber was drawing up a dragon pattern when Jason commented on it, saying it resembled the character Cecil from the 60s cartoon Beanie and Cecil, and asked him to include Beanie in the drawing. Simultaneously, their friend Dan Seitz was also there drawing up the flyer for their next show in Oxnard, California, and drew a character with a similar propeller hat to the Beanie character on the flyer. After that night, the character would go on to reappear in all kinds of artwork for the band and would become one of the more notable mascots of the early 80s SoCal punk scene. Now, the town of Oxnard, California would serve as kind of a home base for RKL in the early 80s. Although they weren't from Oxnard, their close proximity and fast punk sound put them on a lot of bills with other bands from the town's nardcore scene. Like many of the other bands in the Oxnard scene, RKL were picked up by the punk label Mystic Records and released their first 7-inch It's a Beautiful Feeling in 1984 after contributing a few tracks to the label's Nardcore compilation earlier that year. As crazy as this might sound, Bomber actually broke his wrist in a skateboarding accident just before one of the recording sessions, and Mystic Records owner and operator Doug Moody had to tape his wrist up and then tape the drumstick to his hand so the band would be able to complete the recording. The album art was done by Beanie Boy creator Dan Seitz, and Dan would provide artwork for much of the band's future albums, flyers, and merch. Honest to God, I could not imagine what RKL's records and merch would look like without his iconic art style. It's just such a big piece of their image. Following the release of It's a Beautiful Feeling, the band would continue to play regularly all over California and developed a very strong following in San Francisco. In response to this, everyone in the band decided to relocate to Northern California except for rhythm guitarist Alpo, who did not want to leave his home in the Santa Barbara area. A few months after the move, bassist Vince Peppers would also take a leave of absence from RKL to return home and was briefly replaced by Barry Ward. However, Barry's time as the band's bass player would be brief as Vince would eventually return and the band would fill out into a 5-piece again with Barry as the rhythm guitarist. Over the next few months, RKL would contribute several songs to various comps put on by Mystic before returning to SoCal to record their first full-length album, Keep Laughing. Despite the band preferring to play live as a 5-piece, Ward did not actually take part in the recording as he wished to stay in Northern California. Due to his absence, Chris Rest recorded both guitar tracks for the album, and Ward would take his place as rhythm guitarist again after it was completed. Then, following the release in 1985, RKL began touring again and refined their live act as one of the more musically proficient bands of the early 80s punk scene. Despite all these great things going on, though, it was around this time that RKL had a really ugly falling out with Mystic Records. The band had signed a deal in which the label agreed to provide them with merch for a percentage of their sales in return. Although Mystic Records owner Doug Moody has stated the label fulfilled their end of the bargain, members of RKL have said the label provided them with no such merch, and the band had to resort to screening their own shirts and bootlegging their albums to sell them at shows. Due to the conflict between RKL and Doug Moody, the band would sign with Alchemy Records after a tour in 1986 they dubbed the Disaster Tour, and began prepping for their next album. Acting as the band's creative head once more, Bomber steered the band towards a more ambitious direction. While the material did stay true to its fast punk rock roots, this era of the band saw a steep rise in technical musicianship, drawing a great deal of influence from thrash metal and progressive rock. Unsatisfied with where the band was going musically, Vince Peppers decided it was time to call it quits once and for all, and RKL was left yet again without a bass player. Rick Bowerstock would briefly join the band on bass, but would have a falling out with them shortly after joining, and eventually Bomber would take over the role of both bass and drums for the recording of 1987's Rock and Roll Nightmare. Now, if I were to pick one album that fully encompasses the RKL sound, it would definitely be this one. While their previous releases did showcase some of their superior musicianship and songwriting, this was the first time I feel like the band captured what they could really do on record. If you ask me, Rock and Roll Nightmare really defined RKL as a one-of-a-kind band. I can say with the utmost sincerity that I've never heard another band quite like them in all my years of listening to punk music. They also really clearly carved out a niche of technically proficient punk rock that of course would come to prominence in the scene later, but given the noticeable difference in time between the release of this album and when the concept would become more common, Rock and Roll Nightmare captures a completely different energy than bands like Strung Out or Randy that would further solidify the fusion of technical playing and punk rock. The album is part of a totally different era in punk, having come out at a time when the genre was at a very experimental stage. Bands like Fugazi and Operation Ivy were at the top of their game, introducing all kinds of different things to punk, and I have to say, I think RKL was another one of those bands. This record also took the distinct art associated with the band to the next level and included a 32-page comic and lyric book drawn by the one and only Dan Seitz as well. Being the rabid RKL nut I am, I actually do own an original pressing of this LP, but unfortunately I do not own the comic. I'm sure there's none of those available for sale, so I won't even suggest that, but if anyone watching does know where I could find like a PDF file or some pictures of the pages, you should DM me on Instagram. I would love to see what the pages of that thing actually look like. Moving forward, RKL now had a brand new record on their hands, but no one to play bass for their live performances, and after auditioning at least a dozen different people, they finally came into contact with Joe Raposo through an ad in the Maximum Rock and Roll zine. And being the absolute shredder he is, Joe learned all the songs as fast as he could and then promptly headed out on the road with the rest of RKL. The band embarked on a few European tours, which earned them a strong following overseas. In fact, Europe loved RKL so much that their live album Greatest Hits Double Live was recorded in West Berlin in July of 1988. This live album was released through Destiny Records, and its artwork featured an assortment of blotter art provided by the band's friend Mark McLeod, which he referred to as the Institute of Illegal Images. And just as a little added trivia, before leaving on his first European tour with RKL, Joe Raposo actually had to get his parents to sign papers to list Barry Ward as his legal guardian since he was only 17 when he joined the band. Despite all the great things going on, of course RKL were still salty towards Mystic Records, and they decided to re-release their previous recordings without permission from their old label. Everything was sold to Destiny Records and released on a compilation called Revenge is a Beautiful Feeling in 1989. Even though they had such a strong following all the way out in Europe, RKL actually never did a proper US tour to support Rock and Roll Nightmare. Alchemy Records were responsible for promotion, and they were intending to send posters to stores and put flyers in magazines. Unfortunately though, the band's bad luck with labels would come back, and promotion for Rock and Roll Nightmare was limited to only a couple of ads in the Maximum Rock and Roll zine and the SoCal Punk zine Flipside. After things went sour with yet another label, the band decided to part ways for the first time in 1989. Plus, with the stress of being on the road all the time and all the bad blood they had with so many different people, paired with the copious amounts of drugs these guys were probably doing, I think it's pretty safe to assume they didn't have the healthiest band dynamic either. That being said, many of the members from this era have said they felt the band broke up at the worst time it possibly could have, and that if things had gone just a little differently, maybe Bomber wouldn't have decided to pull the plug when he did. Following the first breakup of RKL, the musical genius Bomber Manzullo set out on his next musical endeavor in the world of funk metal. He formed the band Slang, which would later include his former bandmates Joe Raposo and Chris Rest, as well as newcomers Joel Mahan on guitar and Dave Ron on drums. The new band featured Bomber doing vocals, and although they originally planned on releasing an album through Fat Wreck, they wound up signing with Epitaph in 1992 instead. Also, at some point between 92 and 93, Joel would be replaced by Barry Ward, and now 4/5 of the Rock and Roll Nightmare lineup were united once more. After hearing some thoughts from Epitaph's owner Brett Gurwitz, the band actually decided to release the album as RKL and titled it Reactivate. Prior to the album's release, RKL embarked on another European tour for promotion. Due to the drastic changes in sound, though, they were met with a great deal of disappointment from their fans, and the disheartened responses left Bomber wanting to quit the band early on in the tour. Then, after their longtime friend and roadie Will Nutilla died of an overdose in Switzerland, Bomber officially left the band in Italy. After hearing of his departure, Jason Sears flew out to Italy to rejoin his former bandmates and save the tour as best he could. Following the flop of Reactivate, Epitaph also re-released Rock and Roll Nightmare in 1993 as well. Barry Ward has also stated that he thought Reactivate hurt RKL more than any of the other disasters before it, including the Mystic Records fiasco. Even though they'd lost an important songwriter in Bomber, everyone else in RKL was determined to keep going now that Jason was back in the band. Now with the support of the massively successful Epitaph Records behind them, RKL would begin recording their fourth and final album, Riches to Rags, at the Music Annex in Menlo Park, California. The album showcased a self-deprecating spoof of their previous persona and was dedicated to their departed friend Will Nutilla upon its release in December 1994. The album's first single, We're Back, We're Pissed, was featured on one of Epitaph's famous Punk-O-Rama comps, and the second single, Betrayed, appeared on a sample CD for the magazine CMJ New Music Monthly. RKL would shoot their first music video for Betrayed and would also appear on a tabloid news show in a piece about LSD. The band would then embark on a number of tours throughout the US, Europe, and Japan in support of Riches to Rags, and for a while it seemed like they would finally get the break they deserved. After all the vigorous touring, though, tensions began to arise within the band once more, and RKL decided to part ways again. Following the breakup in '96, Barry compiled various live performances, interviews, and on-the-road footage into a video compilation titled Still Flailing After All These Beers. The film was released through Epitaph in 1997 and also featured an exclusive video for the song Take Me Home, as well as a live performance of the band covering Devo's Timing X. After roughly a 4-year hiatus, RKL would come back for one last hurrah in the early 2000s. The band was invited to perform at the opening of Skaters Point Skate Park in Santa Barbara, California in the year 2000. Chris Rest and Jason Sears reunited, and the remaining slots in the band were filled out by 3 of their mutual friends. The longest-lasting lineup of RKL in the early 2000s featured Lagwagon drummer Derek Plord and guitarist Chris Flippin, along with the returning Bomber Manzullo on bass. They would sporadically play shows up and down the West Coast with this lineup, including a performance at the San Francisco Warped Tour in 2002. Towards the end of the band's lifespan, they would go through 2 more member changes with the departures of Bomber and Derek, who would be replaced by Joe Raposo and Boz Rivera. RKL had been writing and recording new material before their final breakup in November 2005, and Chris Flippin has stated that the final split of RKL was a result of Jason Sears' self-destructive behavior that other members felt they were sucked into, even going as far to say as he thought the band was cursed. The unreleased songs they recorded would eventually appear as bonus tracks on the reissue of their live album in 2011. The band's final breakup was followed by the deaths of Bomber Manzullo and Derek Plord later in 2005, and the passing of Jason Sears a year after in 2006. But rather than focus on the negative of the losses or what could have been, I'd much rather talk about the legacy RKL left behind. What I think a lot of people don't realize is how big of an impact RKL actually had on the punk scene of the 90s. I'm sure at least some of you have heard NoFX talk about how RKL were their biggest musical influence, but it doesn't just stop with them. Other notable 90s punk bands like Strung Out, No Use for a Name, Snot, The Dwarves, and even Green Day have expressed a fondness for RKL's music. And given the presence those bands had in the 90s scene, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot more bands from that era were influenced by RKL too. A lot of people also credit Bomber as the first person to pioneer the modern punk beat, and RKL is often cited as the prototype for the sound that would bring punk to prominence in the 90s, or dubbed as your favorite band's favorite band. The band members have also taken part in various other projects. I'm sure a lot of you probably recognize some of the names I mentioned in this video, but everyone in the current lineup of Lagwagon was in RKL at one point in time. And something you might not be as aware of was Bomber's band The Other that he started during his time away from RKL in the mid to late 90s. They only have one album, and it's definitely worth checking out if you get the chance. Unfortunately, it's not on Spotify, but I will provide a YouTube link in the description. And lastly, if you couldn't already tell from everything I've said, I am a huge fan of RKL. They've been one of my favorite bands since high school, and I'm currently working on building up a collection of their LPs. Eventually, I'd like to fill out the whole thing, but right now I just don't have the funds to spend $200 on an original pressing of Riches to Rags. I'll get there eventually, though, I promise. Anyways, I think that sums up our little seminar on RKL here. I think this might actually be my favorite video I've done for this channel so far. But that's enough from me. I want to hear what you guys have to say. What are some of your favorite RKL songs? Do you have a favorite album? How did you get into them in the first place? Thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you next time.